Hello and welcome to Insomniac Dose. You're welcome to comment your city and the time below. I always enjoy reading them. If you find these stories interesting, please consider subscribing. Let's start tonight's story. I moved to Vermont in January, which anyone from Boston will tell you is clinically insane. But after 18 months of sleeping on my friend's couch, dodging calls from my ex and watching my savings evaporate into the city's rent vacuum, insanity started to look like pragmatism. A cousin mentioned a room available in Ashford, population 3,200, located somewhere between quaint and forgotten. And I took it sight unseen. The town was exactly what you'd expect. One main street lined with brick storefronts, half of them dark, the other half stubbornly persisting. There was a diner that closed at 7, a hardware store that seemed to sell mostly bird seed, and hemlock and hearth books wedged between a bakery with soap-filmed windows and a law office that looked like it hadn't seen a client since Carter was president. I'd passed the bookstore twice before I noticed the help wanted sign, handwritten on cream cardstock and taped inside the door. Night clerk needed, quiet environment, inquire within. The interior smelled exactly how you'd want a bookstore to smell. Old paper, dust, something faintly sweet like pipe tobacco, even though I never saw anyone smoking. The layout was a beautiful disaster. Shelves crammed into every available space, crooked aisles that didn't quite line up, a narrow mezzanine balcony overlooking the main floor with a railing that creaked if you breathed on it. In the back corner, a cast-iron fireplace sat sealed behind a metal grate, its bricks blackened from decades of use. Mrs. Delacourt appeared from behind a shelf labeled Local History before I'd even called out. She was 70, maybe older, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that were simultaneously kind and uncomfortably sharp, like she was reading something written on the back of your skull. "The night position," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "I'm good with inventory, customer service, whatever you need." "There are no customers at night," she replied, leading me to the front counter where a vintage register sat next to a newer computer terminal that looked painfully out of place. "We started offering extended hours for online orders. Someone needs to process them, organize stock, and handle the occasional late pickup. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. The door locks to the public at 11. So I'd be alone?" "Yes." She studied me with those sharp eyes. "Is that a problem?" I thought about my current job prospects, which consisted of a grocery store 20 miles away that paid minimum wage and smelled like rotting produce, and shook my head. "No. Sounds perfect, actually. Quiet. I can read between orders." Something flickered across her face. Not quite amusement, not quite concern. "Yes, there are certainly plenty of books." She hired me on the spot, had me fill out a W-4 on a clipboard that might have been older than me, and told me to come back on Thursday at 9:30 for my first shift. As I turned to leave, she opened a drawer behind the counter and withdrew a small laminated card, yellowed at the edges and cracked where it had been folded and unfolded too many times. "Before I forget," she said, handing it to me. "Night shift protocols." The card was an index card, the kind teachers used for vocabulary words covered in what looked like typewriter text. "Hemlock and hearth, night clerk rules. Rule 1. Lock the front door at 11 p.m. sharp. Do not open it for anyone after that, even if they claim to have forgotten something inside. Rule 3. If you hear footsteps in the history aisle after midnight, do not investigate. That section is closed at night. Rule 5. Do not read aloud from any book that does not have a price sticker. Rule 7. If you see a customer browsing after 1:30 a.m., ask them politely to leave. If they do not respond, return to the counter and do not speak to them again. I read it twice, waiting for the punchline. "Is this Are you serious? Completely. What happened to Rules 2, 4, and 6? They're no longer relevant. She folded her hands on the counter, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite parse. I know it seems unusual, Ava. Consider it tradition. The building is old, it has its quirks. I laughed, nervous, trying to show I could be a good sport about whatever small-town eccentricity this was. Right. Quirks. Got it. Mrs. Delacourt didn't laugh with me. She simply placed her hand on the counter, fingers spread like she was steadying herself against something, and said, "Follow them precisely. I've found that precision matters more than understanding." The radiators chose that moment to hiss, a sound like air escaping through teeth, and I felt the temperature in the store shift. Not colder exactly, but denser, like the air had gained weight. "See you Thursday," I managed, pocketing the card. As I stepped back into the January cold, I glanced over my shoulder. Mrs. Delacourt stood exactly where I'd left her, hands still on the counter, watching me through the window with an expression that might have been pity. Thursday arrived wrapped in fresh snow and the particular darkness that comes to New England in deep winter, where night falls at 4:30 and doesn't consider leaving until almost 8. I arrived at 9:30 as instructed, stamping snow off my boots in the small entryway. Mrs. Delacourt walked me through the closing procedures, how to process the online orders that came through the website, where to find packing materials, the system for shelving returns. The computer was older but functional, running some kind of custom inventory software that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. "Bathrooms through there," she said, pointing to a narrow hallway past the history section. "Storage room beside it, but it's locked. I keep the rare items there, you won't need access." "And the basement?" I'd noticed a door near the back marked "Staff Only" with a deadbolt that looked substantial enough to secure a bank vault. "Also locked. Old furnace and electrical. Nothing you need to concern yourself with." She pulled on her coat, a wool number that probably weighed 15 pounds. "The building settles at night. You'll hear creaking, especially when the heat cycles. The mezzanine railing is loose in 2 spots. I've marked them with tape. Don't lean on it." She handed me a key ring with 3 keys: front door, register, and staff bathroom. "Any questions?" I pulled out the laminated card. "Just these rules. Am I really not supposed to open the door after 11? What if there's an emergency? There's a phone behind the counter. Call 911 if necessary, but Ava..." She paused at the door, one hand on the frame. "Don't open the door. Not for forgotten items. Not for someone claiming they're locked out. Not for any reason. Do you understand?" The way she said it, the absolute flatness in her voice, killed any joke I might have made. I nodded. "Good. I'll be back at 6. The door closed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The first 2 hours were exactly what I'd hoped for. Quiet, methodical, almost meditative. I processed 3 online orders, packaged them in brown paper and twine like we were living in some kind of artisanal fantasy. I reshelved a dozen returns, alphabetized the self-help section that had apparently been ransacked by someone with severe organizational anxiety. I made coffee in the small staff area, a corner with a hot plate and a chair, and felt, for the first time in months, like I wasn't actively failing at being an adult. At 10:47, I checked my phone. No messages. Outside, snow had started again, small flakes drifting past the streetlights like suspended ash. At 10:58, I walked to the front door, key in hand. At 11 hours exactly, I turned the deadbolt, feeling it slide home with a solid click. The store seemed to exhale around me. I returned to the counter, pulled out my laptop, and opened the document containing my novel. 14,000 words of a story I'd started 2 years ago and abandoned somewhere around the part where my protagonist discovers her apartment is haunted, which in retrospect felt a little too close to actual lived experience. At 11:07, someone knocked on the door. Not loudly, not frantically. Just 3 measured knocks, the kind a reasonable person makes when they're not trying to be rude but genuinely need assistance. I looked up from my screen. Through the frosted glass of the door, I could see a silhouette. Someone bundled in a heavy winter coat, features obscured by the condensation and the grain of the old glass. Another knock, slightly more insistent. "Hello?" The voice was muffled but audible. Male, maybe. "Hey, I know you're in there. I left my wallet inside. I just need 30 seconds, I promise." I stood, heart rate ticking up slightly, and glanced at the card sitting beside my laptop. Rule 1. Lock the front door at 11 p.m. sharp. Do not open it for anyone after that, even if they claim to have forgotten something inside. The figure jiggled the door handle, not violently, just testing. "Please, I've got my ID, credit cards. I know it's late, but I was just here an hour ago. Brown wallet, I left it on the chair in the..." I picked up the card, reading it again. The person outside sounded perfectly reasonable. Slightly desperate, yes, but in the way anyone would be if they'd lost their wallet in winter in a town where the nearest bank was 20 miles away. But Mrs. Delacourt's voice, "Don't open the door, not for any reason." I approached the door slowly, stopping about 6 feet back. The figure was still there, a dark shape against the white snow, face hidden by shadow and frost. The overhead streetlight cast an orange glow across the stoop, highlighting the falling snow but somehow leaving the figure itself in darkness. "I'm sorry," I called through the glass. "We're closed. You'll have to come back tomorrow morning. We open at 10. Silence. The figure didn't move. "If you leave your name, I can check the lost and found..." "I know you can hear me," the voice said, and something in the tone had changed. Flattened, lost its desperate edge and became something else. Something that sounded less like a person speaking and more like a person reciting lines they'd memorized but didn't understand. "Please," it said again, "open the door." I stepped back, the wooden floorboards creaking under my boots. My hand found my phone, thumb hovering over the emergency dial. The figure remained motionless. No breath clouds in the frigid air, I realized. No shifting weight from foot to foot like someone cold would do. Just standing there, a paper doll in the snow. "I'm not opening the door," I said, voice steadier than I felt. "Come back in the morning." For exactly 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then the knocking stopped. No footsteps, no muttered curses or sounds of someone trudging away through snow. Just nothing. I waited another 30 seconds before approaching the door, pressing my face close to the glass. The stoop was empty, not just empty of people, but empty of footprints. The thin layer of fresh snow that had accumulated in the last hour was smooth, undisturbed, as if no one had stood there at all. My hands were shaking slightly as I returned to the counter. I pulled up the security camera feed on the computer. Mrs. Delacourt had shown me how to access it, one camera pointed at the front door for after-hours monitoring. I scrolled back to 11:05, then 11:07. The footage showed the locked door, the snow falling, the empty stoop illuminated by the street light. No figure, no person approaching, knocking, or standing there. Just an empty doorway and snow that fell undisturbed. But I'd heard it. The knocking, the voice, the door handle jiggling. I'd seen it. I looked down at the laminated card, at Rule 1 in its faded typewriter text, and felt something cold settle into my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. The rule stopped feeling like a joke. I didn't sleep well after that first shift. I'd gotten home a little after 6, climbing the stairs to my rented room as gray dawn light leaked through the windows, and laid in bed staring at the ceiling until my alarm went off at noon. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that silhouette in the door, heard that flattened voice saying please like it was reading from a script. Mrs. Delacourt had seemed unsurprised by my fatigue when I came in for my second shift. She'd simply handed me a thermos of coffee, real coffee, the expensive kind, and said, "It gets easier. The first week is always the hardest." I wanted to ask what exactly was supposed to get easier, but something in her expression suggested I wouldn't get a useful answer. Instead, I accepted the coffee, tasted chicory and honey, and nodded my thanks. The Friday night shift began identically to the first. Lock the door at 11, process orders, reshelve returns. I kept the laminated rule card visible on the counter, glancing at it like a talisman. Outside, the temperature had dropped below zero, turning the world into something crystalline and hostile. The streetlights caught the frost on the windows, refracting it into strange geometric patterns. At 11:43, my phone buzzed, a text from Liam Chen, a local grad student I'd met at the diner my first week in town. He was studying folklore at the State University and had mentioned he sometimes helped Mrs. Delacourt with appraisals of rare books. "Still at the bookstore? Mind if I swing by while I wait for my ride?" Stuck in town for another hour. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Then, "Doors locked after 11 store policy. I know the code for the staff entrance in back. Mrs. D lets me use it sometimes, just want to sit and read, won't bug you." That seemed reasonable. I knew Liam and had shared a booth and mediocre pie with him. He was harmless, enthusiastic about local history to the point of being tedious but friendly enough. "Fine. But I'm working, so no offense if I'm boring. You got it. 10 minutes." He arrived 12 minutes later, coming through the back hallway with snow in his hair and a backpack slung over one shoulder. Liam was 25, Korean-American, perpetually caffeinated, and currently wearing a jacket that looked like it had been designed for someone 3 sizes larger. "It's colder than a witch's." He stopped, grinning. "Well, appropriately cold for Vermont in January. How's your second night in the literary salt mines?" "Quiet," I said, which was technically true. "I'm still learning the inventory system." "Oh, that thing's ancient. I think it runs on DOS or something equally prehistoric." He dropped his bag on one of the reading chairs near the counter and looked around with obvious affection. "I love this place at night. It's like the books are sleeping." I couldn't tell if he was being poetic or weird. "Mrs. Delacourt gave you a rule card, too." His smile faltered slightly. "Rule card?" I held up the laminated index card. "Night shift protocols. Lock the door at 11. Don't investigate footsteps in the history aisle. Don't read from unstickered books, that sort of thing." Liam took the card, read it, and actually laughed. A genuine, delighted sound. "Oh, this is perfect. This is exactly the kind of thing she would do. Ava, you've been initiated into Vermont's favorite pastime, making up ghost stories to mess with people from the city. It's not real. Of course it's not real. Look." He gestured around the store. "Hemlock and Hearth has been here since the 1890s. It's old, it creaks, it probably has rats in the walls. Old ladies in small towns have exactly 2 hobbies: historical societies and making up atmospheric bullshit to spook the newcomers. It's like a rite of passage." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. "So you've never heard anything weird here? No footsteps, no strange customers?" "I mean, I've heard footsteps, sure. It's an old building, pipes expanding, wood settling, the whole 9 yards. He handed the card back. "Trust me, I study folklore for a living. I know the difference between genuine oral tradition and someone having a laugh. This," he tapped the card, "is affectionate hazing." The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through 4 years of college and 6 years of administrative work in Boston, seized on this explanation like a life raft. Of course, Mrs. Delacourt seemed eccentric. Probably every new hire got the same treatment. The figure at the door had been real. Just someone who'd left before the camera's refresh rate caught them, or who'd approached from an angle the camera didn't cover. The lack of footprints was just the snow blowing around, filling them in. "You're probably right," I said, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. "I'm definitely right. Now, can I make myself tea in the back? I brought my own bag. I'm not a barbarian." "Go ahead." Liam disappeared into the small staff area. I heard him humming something tuneless, the sound of water running, the click of the hot plate. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows in their frames. The building creaked around us, ancient joints settling against the cold. At 12:17 a.m., I heard footsteps. They came from the history aisle, the section that ran along the back right corner of the store, shelves crammed with local histories, military memoirs, and what Mrs. Delacourt called her specialized collection. Measured footsteps, unhurried like someone browsing at a leisurely pace. I looked up from the computer where I'd been processing an order for 3 paperback mysteries. The history aisle was visible from the counter if I leaned slightly to the left, a narrow corridor of shelves disappearing into shadow. I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps continued. 4 steps, pause, 2 steps, pause. The rhythm of someone moving from shelf to shelf, scanning titles. Rule 3 surfaced in my memory. If you hear footsteps in the history aisle after midnight, do not investigate. That section is closed at night. Liam emerged from the back, carrying a chipped mug that said, "Librarians do it by the book," in faded letters. He noticed my expression immediately. "What's wrong? Do you hear that?" He paused, head tilted, listening. The footsteps continued, now accompanied by a faint sound like pages turning. "Hear what?" "The footsteps in history." His face lit up with that particular expression people get when they think they're about to prove a point. "See? Pipes. Or maybe something fell and it's rolling. Books do that sometimes. When they're shelved wrong, they'll slowly tip over and—" "Liam, I can hear someone walking." "Then let's go look. I'll prove it's just building noise or a draft or something equally boring." He was already moving toward the history aisle before I could stop him. I grabbed the rule card, idiotic like it would protect me, and followed, my heartbeat suddenly loud in my ears. "Come on," Liam called back, his voice cheerful and echoing slightly in the narrow space. "We'll solve this mystery in 30 seconds, and you can mock my folklore degree for being—" He stopped so abruptly I nearly ran into his back. The history aisle was empty. No customers, no movement, no rats or rolling books or anything else that might explain the footsteps. The shelves stretched back into shadow, perfectly still, the spines of books aligned neatly as Mrs. Delacour had left them. But on the floor about halfway down the aisle was a book. It lay open, face up, pages fluttering slightly as if caught in a breeze, except there was no breeze. The windows were sealed and the heating vents were in a different part of the store entirely. The pages moved anyway, turning themselves with a soft whisper sound that made something cold slither down my spine. Liam approached it slowly, curiosity overriding whatever caution he should have felt. "Huh, that's weird." I stayed back, every instinct screaming to leave, to go back to the counter, to follow Rule 3 and not investigate. "Liam, don't—" But he was already bending down, reaching for the book. It was an old hardcover bound in dark leather with no dust jacket. The spine had no title. The cover had no printing at all, just aged leather and binding. "Probably one of her rare finds," Liam said, his voice taking on that academic tone people use when they're trying to reassure themselves. "Unmarked volumes are sometimes proof copies, or—" He lifted the book, turning it over. "Private printings that never went to—" He stopped. I could see his face from where I stood, and the color had drained from it. "It doesn't have a price sticker." Rule 5. Do not read aloud from any book that does not have a price sticker. "Put it down," I said quietly. "It's fine, it's just—" He opened to the first page where text was visible in an old-fashioned typeface, slightly irregular, like it had been letterpress printed. I'll just check the first line, see if I can identify what it... Liam, put it down. But he was already reading half aloud, that particular mumble people do when they're reading to themselves. In the house that collects the words, in the space between the written and the overhead lights flickered. The footsteps, which had stopped when we entered the aisle, resumed, but louder now, and multiplied. 4 sets of footsteps, maybe 5, coming from both ends of the history aisle at once, from shelves where no one could possibly stand. From above us, from the mezzanine, even though I could see that the mezzanine was empty. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. I lunged forward, snatched the book from Liam's hands before he could finish the sentence, and slammed it shut. The sound echoed like a door closing in a cathedral. The footsteps stopped immediately. The lights steadied. The temperature held at its new, lower state for another 3 seconds, then gradually climbed back to something approaching normal. Liam stood frozen, the book now on the floor between us where I'd dropped it. His eyes were too wide, his breathing shallow and quick. "What the fuck was that?" I didn't answer. I was staring at the book, which now lay closed on the worn wooden floor, innocent and dormant. After a moment, I used my boot to slide it back toward the shelf, not wanting to touch it with my hands. "That's not pipes," Liam whispered. "That's not building noise. Ava, what the fuck was—" "We're leaving this aisle," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "Now." He didn't argue. We backed out together, keeping our eyes on the shadows, and didn't turn away until we'd reached the counter. Liam collapsed into one of the reading chairs, his tea forgotten, his backpack sliding to the floor unnoticed. "I need you to explain what just happened," he said eventually. "I can't. But you knew. You knew not to read from that book." I showed him the card again, pointing to Rule 5. He read it 3 times, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something approaching fear. "This is real," he said finally. Not a question, a realization. "I think so. But that's not possible. This is a bookstore in Vermont. Things like that don't—" He stopped, pressing his palms against his eyes. I need to go right now." His ride arrived 10 minutes later. Liam left without finishing his tea, without his usual cheerful goodbye, looking back at the store like it was something that might follow him. Before he went out the back door, he paused. "Mrs. Delacourt," he said. "She knew. She knows what this place is." "Yes." "And she hired you anyway?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, then stepped out into the cold. I returned to the counter, to the computer and the half-finished order and the laminated rule card that suddenly felt less like hazing and more like a survival guide. The store settled around me with its creaks and hisses, and somewhere in the history aisle I thought I heard a book fall from a shelf. A soft thump, like something giving up or giving in. At 6:03 a.m., as I was packing up, my phone buzzed with a text from Liam's roommate. "Did Elle seem okay to you? Called in sick to his TA gig, says he has a migraine and keeps hearing footsteps in his apartment." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Tell him to rest. It'll pass." I didn't know if that was true, but I'd followed the rules mostly, and I was fine. Mostly. Liam didn't respond to my texts for 3 days. His roommate said he was taking a mental health break, which I assumed meant he was avoiding anything connected to Hemlock and Hearth. I didn't blame him. I'd spent my own days off researching the bookstore, or trying to. The local library had a small historical collection, but most of it focused on the town's timber industry and railway connections. The bookstore warranted a single photograph in a 1923 town register. The same narrow storefront, the same crooked sign, looking essentially identical to how it looked now. The photograph's caption read, Hemlock and Hearth Books, Estancia 1894, Proprietor E. Granger. No mention of unusual occurrences, no footnotes about strange rules or supernatural events. Just a bookstore that had persisted through depression and war and digital revolution, somehow still standing when half the town had folded. I returned to work on Tuesday feeling no more informed, but significantly more uneasy. Mrs. Delacourt was locking up the register when I arrived, pulling on her heavy wool coat with methodical precision. "How was your weekend, Ava?" "Fine," I lied. "Quiet." "Liam called," she said, not looking at me. "He wanted to know if we had records of previous employees, specifically night shift clerks." "What did you tell him?" "That personnel records are confidential." She picked up her purse, a practical leather bag that looked military grade. "He also asked if I knew what the house that collects words meant." My stomach dropped. "That's what was in the book, the one without a sticker." "Yes, I know." She paused at the door, hand on the frame in that particular way she had, like she was steadying herself against something invisible. "The book has been here longer than I have. We don't shelve it. We don't catalog it. But it appears periodically in different sections, sometimes history, sometimes philosophy, once in children's, which was particularly disturbing." "What is it?" "I don't know. I've never read it." She looked at me directly, and for the first time I saw genuine fatigue in her expression, the kind that comes from years rather than days. "But I know that people who read from it aloud tend to experience auditory disturbances afterward. Repetitions. As if the words are trying to finish being spoken." "How long does it last?" "For some, a few days. For others—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Liam will be fine. He only read half a sentence. Miriam Hollis, who worked here in 2003, read 3 full pages before I could stop her." "What happened to her?" "She quit after 2 weeks. Last I heard, she'd moved to New Mexico." Mrs. Delacourt adjusted her purse strap. "Very dry there, very quiet. I imagine she appreciates that." The door closed behind her with that same definitive sound, and I was alone with the books and the rules and the growing certainty that I'd taken a job in something that used to be a bookstore but had become something else through sheer accumulation of years and words and whatever fed on both. The shift went smoothly until 12:34 a.m., when I decided to investigate the back room. It wasn't technically against the rules. The laminated card said nothing about staff areas, but Mrs. Delacourt's vague warnings about not needing access to certain spaces had lodged in my brain like a splinter. The back hallway was narrow, wood-paneled with 3 doors, bathroom unlocked, storage room locked, and basement locked and deadbolted like it contained the nuclear codes. I tried the storage room first, more out of curiosity than genuine investigative intent. The knob didn't turn, but beside the door, tucked on a high shelf behind a stack of shipping boxes, I found a cardboard file box labeled Staff MISC in faded marker. Inside, chaos index cards, dozens of them covered in different handwriting. Some typed, some handwritten, some printed on dot matrix printers that hadn't existed since the 90s. They were dated mostly with names attached. "Don't reshelve anything that moves on its own. If a book falls off the shelf while you're holding it, leave it on the floor until morning." Marcus, 1987. "The man in the beige coat doesn't cast a reflection in the window." "Don't offer him a receipt." Jennifer, 1995. "If the phone rings after 2 a.m., answer it, but don't speak first. Wait until they speak. If they ask for Sarah, hang up immediately." David, 1991. There were at least 50 cards, each documenting some small, specific, terrifying protocol. Some had been crossed out, rendered obsolete by whatever logic governed this place. Others had dates written beside them. resolved 1999, or no longer active, as if the building's hauntings were subject to revision and amendment like a corporate policy manual. Beneath the index cards, I found a ledger, old-fashioned, bound in green fabric with columns for names, dates of employment, and notes. The entries went back to 1967, which was apparently as far as Mrs. Delacourt's record-keeping extended. Many of the names had brief notations. Thomas Brennan, 1973-1974, quit after incident in basement, declined exit interview. Sarah Locke, 1982-1983, terminated for repeatedly violating Rule 4, obsolete, no forwarding address. Marcus Webb, 1985-1989, longest-serving night clerk, retired to Maine, sent Christmas cards until 2007. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a plastic shopping bag, was a small leather-bound journal. The cover had no title, but the inside front page had an inscription in neat masculine handwriting. David Crane, Night Observations, Hemlock and Hearth Books, 1990-1993. I carried everything back to the counter, spread it out under the desk lamp, and began to read. David's journal was methodical, almost academic in tone, like he was documenting a natural phenomenon rather than working in a haunted bookstore. The early entries from 1990 were skeptical, amused. Mrs. D gave me the rules today, very committed to the bit. The building is old, sure, but old doesn't mean supernatural. Still, the pay is decent and I can study between customers. We'll play along. By late 1991, the tone had shifted. Heard the footsteps in history again tonight. I know the building settles, I know pipes make noise, but pipes don't walk in rhythm. Pipes don't pause at shelf sections like they're reading titles. I followed the rule this time. Didn't investigate. The sound stopped at 12:47. 1992 brought more detailed observations. The customer who doesn't cast a reflection came in again. Beige coat, as mentioned in Jennifer's card. He asked for a book on local genealogy. I processed the sale normally, didn't offer a receipt as instructed. When he left, I checked the register tape. The transaction isn't recorded, no sale, no inventory adjustment, as if it never happened. But the book is gone from the shelf. Found another book without a price sticker today, shelved in philosophy. Dark green cover, no title, didn't touch it. Used a ruler to push it to the back of the shelf, where no one will see it. These books are like landmines. The entries from late 1992 and early 1993 became increasingly focused on the building itself. I've been mapping the store, measuring. The dimensions don't add up. From the outside, the building is approximately 35 feet deep. But if you measure the main floor plus the back hallway plus the locked storage room, you get at least 42 feet. Where are the extra 7 feet? I asked Mrs. D. She said, some spaces don't need to be measured. That's not an answer. The basement door has been deadbolted since before I started working here. Tonight I put my ear against it. There's air movement on the other side, not wind, breathing. Slow, patient breathing like something large and sleeping. This building isn't just old, it's occupied. Miriam started last week. Nice woman, graduate student, needs the money. I showed her the rules. She laughed the same way I did 3 years ago. I wanted to warn her more seriously, but what would I say? The store is alive and it's learning how to use us? She'd think I was insane. Maybe I am. Miriam read from the unstickered book tonight. I tried to stop here, but she'd already finished the first paragraph before I reached philosophy. Now she says she hears her own voice reading the passage back to her when she's alone. It follows her between the shelves. Mrs. D says it will fade in a few weeks. I don't think Miriam will last a few weeks. The final entry was dated March 14, 1993. I'm giving my 2 weeks' notice tomorrow. This job has taught me that there are places where the boundaries between story and reality have worn thin through repetition. Books are spells, words are instructions. And this building has been collecting both for over a century. The thing in the basement isn't sleeping anymore. I can hear it moving at night, shifting against the door like it's testing the lock. Mrs. D says it's always been there, that it's part of why the store exists in the first place, to contain it, to feed it stories so it doesn't go looking for them elsewhere. I don't know if I believe that, but I know I can't stay here. The longer you work nights at Hemlock and Hearth, the more it knows about you. And what it knows, it can use. To whoever finds this, follow the rules, don't read the journal to the end, and for God's sake, don't try to understand what this place is. Understanding makes you complicit. Ignorance might keep you alive. I closed the journal with shaking hands. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The building creaked around me, floors, walls, ceiling, like something settling into a new position. At 1:17 a.m., a book fell from a shelf in the children's section with a sound like a door closing. I didn't investigate. When I went to reshelve the journal and papers at the end of my shift, I found a new index card sitting on top of the box, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. If you read too much about what the store is, it will start reading about you. David, 1993. The card hadn't been there when I'd opened the box. I put everything away, locked the front door at 6:05 a.m., and drove home with the heat in my car turned up as high as it would go, trying to stop shivering. Mrs. Delacourt was right. Understanding didn't help. It only made the fear more specific. I didn't tell Mrs. Delacourt that I'd found David's journal. Something in me, the part that had studied literature in college, that understood the power of narrative, sensed that acknowledging what I'd learned might change my relationship with the store, might make me less of an employee and more of a participant in whatever story the building was trying to tell. But I couldn't leave it alone either. On Thursday, I arrived half an hour early for my shift. Mrs. Delacourt was still at the counter, reconciling the day's receipts with the unhurried precision of someone who'd done the same task for 30 years. She looked up as I entered, snowflakes still melting in my hair. "You're keen tonight." "I wanted to ask about the storage room," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just curious what's back there. Rare books, you said?" Her hands stilled on the receipts. "Among other things." "Could I see? I worked at a used bookstore in Boston. I know how to handle first editions." "No." The flatness of her tone killed any follow-up question in my throat. She looked at me with those sharp eyes, and I had the uncomfortable sensation of being read, the way you'd read a page to determine if it contained anything useful. "The storage room contains items that have been removed from general circulation," she said finally. "Books that caused problems, items that were donated but couldn't be sold. Things that, for various reasons, need to be kept but not accessed. Like the books without price stickers." "Among other things," she repeated. "Ava, I appreciate your curiosity. I understand the impulse to investigate, to make sense of what you've experienced. But this building rewards ignorance and punishes comprehension. The less you understand about what it is, the safer you are." "David Crane understood," I said before I could stop myself. "He worked here for 3 years. He documented everything." Mrs. Delacourt's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted. A realization, perhaps, or resignation. "You found his journal." "It was in a box in the back hallway. I know where it was. I left it there." She returned to her receipts, sorting them into piles with mechanical efficiency. David was a good clerk, meticulous, intelligent. He lasted longer than most because he treated the store like a puzzle to be solved rather than a threat to be survived. But he quit. Yes, he quit because he realized that solving the puzzle meant becoming part of it. She closed the cash register, the drawer sliding shut with a definitive click. Understanding what this place is doesn't give you power over it, Ava. It gives it power over you. You become someone who knows, and knowledge is a form of participation. Then why keep the journal? Why keep all those index cards and records? Because forgetting entirely is just as dangerous as understanding completely. The rules exist as a middle path. Enough knowledge to survive, not enough to entangle. She pulled on her coat. David thought he could document his way to safety, map the store, measure the inconsistencies, and catalog the anomalies. But the more he wrote, the more the store had to work with. Stories create patterns. Patterns create expectations, and this building feeds on expectations. She paused at the door, her hand in that familiar position on the frame. If you need to know something, know this. Hemlock and Hearth has been many things over the years, a general store, a meeting hall, and a boarding house during the railway years. But it's been a bookstore specifically since 1894. And in that time it has accumulated more than just inventory. Accumulated what? Narrative potential. Every book is a story. Every story is a pattern, and patterns repeated enough times in the same place create grooves in reality, grooves deep enough that things can follow them into our world. She opened the door, letting in a gust of cold air that made the overhead lights flicker. The building isn't haunted, Ava, it's saturated. And saturation, given enough time, achieves consciousness. She left. I stood there for a long moment processing, then walked to the counter and looked at the store. Really looked at it. The shelves are crammed with thousands of stories. The narrow aisles seem to shift slightly depending on your angle. The mezzanine that overlooked everything like the balcony of a theater. A theater. Yes, that's what this place was starting to feel like. Not a store, but a stage. And I was performing some role I hadn't auditioned for, reading from a script I couldn't see but was expected to know. At 12:52 a.m., while reshelving returns in the self-help section, I noticed a gap on one of the shelves. Not a normal gap where a book had sold or been checked out, but a deliberate space about 8 inches wide with the books on either side pushed carefully to create it. In the gap, something glinted. I reached in carefully and pulled out a small tarnished key on a loop of string. It was old, the kind of skeleton key that opened the simple locks common in pre-war construction. A piece of masking tape was wrapped around the string with a single word written on it in faded pencil. Storage. My heart rate kicked up. I looked around the empty store, listening for any indication that this was a test, a trap, something left deliberately for me to find. The building creaked its usual night sounds. The radiators hissed, nothing else. I pocketed the key. At 2:17 a.m., I stood in the back hallway facing the locked storage room door. The key hung heavy in my pocket. Every rational instinct said to leave it alone, to follow Mrs. Delacourt's warning, to maintain my ignorance. But David's words echoed in my memory. The longer you work nights at Hemlock and Hearth, the more it knows about you. If the store was learning me, reading me, then maybe I needed to read it back. I put the key in the lock. It turned with surprising ease and the door swung open on well-oiled hinges. The storage room was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, and lined floor to ceiling with metal shelving units. But unlike the rest of the store, which felt cramped and organic, this space had a clinical quality. Everything was labeled, sorted, and contained. The shelves held books, yes, but also other things. A ceramic bowl with hairline cracks running through it. A set of 3 candlesticks, their brass tarnished black. A mirror turned to face the wall. A collection of photographs in a shoebox, none in frames. I approached the nearest shelf. The books were organized by date removed from circulation, each with a small tag noting the year and reason. 1978. Voices reported when opened. 1989. Pages would not stop turning. 2001. Content changes depending on the reader. I pulled one at random. A slim volume bound in cracked red leather dated 1995, reason listed as temporal inconsistencies. I opened it carefully. It was a novel, or the beginning of one in German. The handwriting was ornate, 19th century, the kind done with a steel nib pen. But as I watched, the text began to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but letter by letter, word by word. The German transformed into French, then Italian, then English. The English passage read, "She stands in the room that should not be entered, reading the book that should not be opened, and wonders if she is still following the rules or if she has become part of what the rules are designed to contain." I closed the book so fast I nearly dropped it. On the shelf beside it, a children's picture book lay open. I hadn't touched it, hadn't opened it, but it lay there, spine cracked, showing an illustration of a bookstore interior. The drawing was remarkably detailed. Shelves, a counter, a mezzanine balcony. In the illustration at the counter was a small figure, a woman with dark hair wearing jeans and a green sweater. I was wearing a green sweater. As I stared, the illustrated figure moved. Not animation exactly, but a subtle shift in position as if the drawing was updating itself. The figure turned slightly as if looking toward the back of the illustrated store, looking toward where the storage room would be. I stumbled backward, hit the doorframe, and forced myself to look away from the book. My breathing was rapid, shallow, the kind that precedes panic. The clinical organization of the room suddenly felt less like preservation and more like containment. These weren't just problematic books, they were active ones, ongoing ones. Stories that hadn't finished being told and were using whatever means available to continue. On the top shelf, I noticed a ledger identical to the one I'd found with David's journal. This one was labeled Incidents Supplementary. I pulled it down, hands shaking, and flipped through it. The entries documented events that the main ledger had only hinted at. August 12, 1973, Thomas Brennan entered the basement despite repeated warnings. Found 3 hours later at the front door with no memory of intervening time. Reported smell of soil and old paper. Quit immediately. March 3, 1982, Sarah Locke began answering questions no one had asked. When pressed, she claimed she could hear what the store wanted to know. Terminated after she attempted to catalog customers instead of books. November 18, 1989. Marcus Webb reported seeing himself shelving books in history aisle while simultaneously standing at the counter. Doppelganger did not acknowledge him. Phenomenon lasted 7 minutes before other Marcus turned a corner and disappeared. January 27, 2003, Miriam Hollis completed reading 3 pages from the unstickered volume before intervention. Subsequently reported hearing the passage recited in her own voice during all waking hours. Frequency decreased over 6 weeks but never fully ceased. Relocated to New Mexico for climate reasons. The most recent entry was dated 2 months before I'd been hired. October 4th. The previous night clerk, Emma Stiles, failed to lock door at 11:00 p.m. due to distraction. Customer entered at 11:07, browsed for approximately 15 minutes, made no purchase. Review of security footage shows no customer on the recording. Emma reported customers felt wrong, like they were practicing being a person. The clerk resigned the following morning. Position vacant. I was the replacement for someone who'd quit because they'd let the wrong thing inside. A sound made me look up. The children's book on the shelf, the one with the illustration of the bookstore, had turned a page on its own. The new page showed the same bookstore interior, but now the illustrated figure was no longer at the counter. She was in a back room surrounded by shelves holding a book. The perspective of the drawing made it clear. I was looking at an illustration of myself, in this room right now. And in the illustration behind the figure in the doorway was a shadow, tall, indistinct, but definitely present. I spun around. The doorway was empty. I looked back at the book. In the illustration, the shadow had moved closer to the figure. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I dropped the ledger, stepped out of the storage room, and locked the door behind me with shaking hands. The key went back in my pocket, and I returned to the counter where the lights were brightest and the sight lines were clearest. For the rest of the shift, I didn't move from that spot. At 5:47 a.m., as dawn began to gray the windows, I checked the children's section on my way out. The picture book was back on the shelf, properly positioned, spine out. I pulled it carefully. It was a normal book, a story about a rabbit who lost his mittens. The illustrations were simple watercolors, nothing resembling a bookstore. No figure in a green sweater, no shadow in a doorway. But tucked between the pages, I found a single index card, written in handwriting I now recognized as David's. The storage room shows you what you're becoming if you stay too long. Whatever you saw, that's your future if you don't quit. DK. I left the card where I found it, reshelved the book, and walked out into the February cold, feeling as if I'd just received a warning from someone who'd escaped with his life. I didn't sleep after that shift. I drove home as the sun rose over frozen fields, went up to my room and sat on my bed fully clothed, staring at the wall and trying to decide if I was brave enough to quit or foolish enough to stay. The money was good. Better than anything else I'd find in Ashford or the surrounding towns without a significant commute. But money didn't matter much if you were slowly being absorbed into a sentient building's collection of stories. At 2 p.m., I called the bookstore. Mrs. Delacourt answered on the third ring, her voice crisp and businesslike. Hemlock and Hearth Books. It's Ava. I need to talk to you before my shift tonight. A pause. You found the storage room. How did you... I stopped. Of course she knew. Either the store told her or she'd left the key for me to find, or she'd simply predicted the inevitable progression of curiosity to trespass. Yes, I found it. Come in at 9 instead of 9:30, we'll talk. She hung up before I could respond. When I arrived that evening, the store was dark except for a single lamp on the counter and the warm glow from the sealed fireplace, which shouldn't have been glowing at all since it was permanently closed. But the light was there, casting dancing shadows across the philosophy section like something was burning inside those sealed bricks. Mrs. Delacourt sat in one of the reading chairs near the counter, hands folded in her lap, looking older than I'd ever seen her. Smaller somehow, as if the building's weight was resting directly on her shoulders. Sit, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. I sat. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, snow had started again, small flakes that clung to the windows like they were trying to see inside. I knew you'd find it eventually, Mrs. Delacourt said finally. The storage room. Curiosity is a job requirement in a way. Someone who never questions, never investigates, they don't last long either. They miss important details and violate rules out of carelessness rather than intention. The store prefers employees who are paying attention. So you wanted me to find it? I wanted you to choose whether or not to look. There's a difference. She shifted in her chair, the wood creaking beneath her. Every night clerk eventually faces the same decision. Accept the rules as arbitrary survival mechanisms, or seek to understand what they're protecting you from. Those who choose ignorance either quit within a few weeks or settle into a kind of resigned acceptance. Those who choose understanding either become too entangled to leave safely, or they learn just enough to know they should run. David ran. David survived. Marcus Webb survived, though he moved to Maine and, according to his Christmas cards, refused to enter any building older than 20 years for the rest of his life. Jennifer Carver survived by adopting a strict policy of aggressive skepticism about everything she experienced here. She convinced herself it was all hallucinations brought on by carbon monoxide from the old furnace. Mrs. Delacourt's expression softened slightly, something almost like affection. The human mind is remarkably good at protecting itself. And the ones who didn't survive? She was quiet for a moment. The fireplace light flickered, and I could have sworn I heard something inside those sealed bricks. Not fire exactly, but the whisper of pages turning, of words being read in a voice too low to distinguish. "Sarah Locke is in a care facility in Massachusetts," Mrs. Delacourt said. "She still insists she can hear the store asking questions, even from 2 states away." Thomas Brennan disappeared in 1981, simply didn't show up for a family gathering, and no one's seen him since. His sister thinks he went west to start over, but I received a postcard from him 3 years after he vanished. No return address, postmarked from here. From Ashford. It said, "Still in the stacks, can't find the exit." My skin went cold. You think he's still here? In the building? I think the building has more rooms than we can access. More floors, more basements, more storage areas that exist in the space between what is and what's written. And I think that people who violate certain rules, the important ones, the ones that aren't on any card, sometimes find themselves in those other spaces. She looked at me directly. "You asked me what this place is. I'll tell you what I believe, but belief isn't the same as knowledge, and knowledge, as I've warned you, is dangerous here." I nodded, not trusting my voice. This building has been a repository for stories since before it was a bookstore. When it was a meeting hall, people gathered here to share news, gossip, and plans. When it was a boarding house, residents would sit in the common room and tell stories to pass the winter nights. Ghost stories, war stories, tales brought from other countries by railway workers. Every story told in a space leaves a residue like smoke staining a ceiling. In most places, that residue fades, but some structures, by virtue of age or materials or something in their fundamental architecture, absorb stories instead of releasing them. She gestured around us at the shelves and books and narrow aisles. By 1894, when Edmund Granger converted this building into a bookstore, it was already saturated. Already conscious in a way, though consciousness might be the wrong word. It was attentive. And then he filled it with books, thousands of stories, tens of thousands, all arranged and categorized and shelved with care. Each book has a narrative pattern. Each pattern reinforces the others. Over decades, the boundaries between the stories on the shelves and the story of the building itself began to blur. So the store is what? Alive? "The store is a text," she said. "A story that's been writing itself for over a century, using employees and customers and books as its words. It doesn't want to harm you exactly, it wants to include you. To make you part of its narrative continuity. And the more you understand about what it is, the easier it is for it to write you into its pages." The implications of that settled over me like cold water. The illustration in the children's book, that was it, showing me my role in its story. "Yes, you're a character now, Ava. The question is whether you're a main character, a supporting role, or a cautionary tale in the margins." She leaned forward, her sharp eyes catching the firelight. "The rules exist to keep you from becoming too central to the narrative. As long as you follow them, you remain an observer, an employee, someone who works here but isn't of here. The moment you break a rule, you start participating. And participation is how it writes you in permanently. Why do you stay?" The question came out more accusatory than I'd intended. "If you know all this, If you've seen people disappear or go crazy or get trapped, why are you still here? Mrs. Delacourt smiled, but there was no humor in it. Because someone has to be the keeper. Someone has to maintain the rules, update them when patterns change, and guide new employees through the first dangerous weeks. If I leave, if there's no one who understands even partially what this place is, then it will simply consume whoever works here with no warning, no protection. The rules are a mercy, Ava. They're the accumulated wisdom of everyone who survived long enough to document a pattern. But you said understanding makes you complicit. It does. I've been complicit for 34 years. I've fed it stories by running a bookstore. I've fed it employees by hiring people like you. I can't leave because I'm too deeply written in. I'm the guardian now, the keeper of rules, the weary witness who warns the protagonist. That's my role in its narrative, and I've played it so long that I'm not sure I exist independently anymore. She said this with no self-pity, just a flat acceptance that was somehow more disturbing than fear would have been. That's insane. Yes, but it's also true. Both things can exist simultaneously here. That's the nature of a place where stories have worn reality thin. She stood, smoothing her skirt. You have a choice to make, Ava. You can quit, tonight, right now. Walk out and don't come back. The store will be disappointed, but you haven't been here long enough to be essential to any major plot threads. You'll have nightmares for a while, maybe a few months of being unable to enter bookstores without feeling watched. But you'll survive, and eventually it will fade. Or you stay. You learn the rhythms of this place, keep the rules, maintain the boundaries. You last 6 months, a year, maybe longer if you're disciplined. And when you finally leave, if you leave, you'll carry it with you forever. Every bookstore will feel wrong. Every library will whisper at the edge of your hearing. You'll see yourself in reflections that aren't quite right. But you'll also have faced something genuinely impossible and survived. That knowledge, that certainty that the world is stranger and more permeable than most people can imagine. Some find it horrifying. Others find it essential. She pulled on her coat and collected her purse. I can't make this decision for you. But I can tell you one more thing. One piece of guidance that's not on any card because it's too personal to codify. If something in this store ever calls you by a name they shouldn't know, a childhood nickname, a pet name from a relationship, a name you've never used in public, do not answer. That's them testing how much of you they've already read. Once they know your true names, the ones that define you, they can start writing you more directly. She paused at the door, her hand in that familiar position. Choose carefully, Ava. Not many people get to decide consciously whether they want to be part of a story. Most of us are just born into narratives we didn't select. But you're still at the threshold. You can still walk away. The door closed behind her. I stood there in the empty store, surrounded by thousands of stories, and realized I had no idea what I was going to do. At 11 p.m., I locked the front door. At midnight, I heard footsteps in the history aisle and didn't investigate. At 1:30 a.m., I processed online orders and pretended I'd made a decision. But the truth was I'd already decided the moment I'd unlocked that storage room. You don't seek out the monster's lair because you're planning to run. You do it because some part of you wants to see the monster clearly, wants to understand it, wants to know what you're really dealing with. I was staying, at least for now. The next 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost normal. I arrived at 9:30, received whatever cryptic non-advice Mrs. Delacourt offered that evening, and spent 6 hours processing orders, shelving books, and meticulously following the rules. The store tested me occasionally. Footsteps in history at 12:15 a.m., a book falling in biography at 2:34 a.m., the faint sound of pages turning in a section I knew was empty. but nothing escalated. It felt like a truce, or perhaps an evaluation period. Liam started responding to texts again. He said the auditory disturbances had mostly faded, reduced to occasional moments when he'd hear a whisper of that passage from the unstickered book, usually when he was falling asleep. "Like my brain saved the audio file," he texted, and randomly hits play. He didn't ask about the bookstore, didn't suggest visiting. We talked about normal things, his thesis on Vermont folklore, my slowly progressing novel, The Weather, and carefully avoided mentioning the night he'd learned that folklore could be real. On my 14th shift, a Friday in late February, a winter storm rolled in around dinner time. By the time I arrived at the store, snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets that reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet. The town plows were already struggling to keep up, and the Weather Service had issued a warning about potential power outages. "I'll understand if you want to skip tonight," Mrs. Delacourt said, though her expression suggested she hoped I wouldn't. "The storm's supposed to peak around midnight." "I have four-wheel drive and nowhere else to be," I told her. "I'll be fine." She nodded, looking almost relieved. "There are candles and flashlights under the counter if the power fails. The emergency lighting should last for several hours, but the battery backup is old. If everything goes dark, stay at the counter and wait for dawn. Don't navigate the aisles without light." "Is that a rule?" "It's advice. There's a difference." She pulled on her coat, a heavier one tonight, more appropriate for the storm. "The building behaves differently in complete darkness. Distances change. Sounds become unreliable. It's easy to become disoriented, and disorientation leads to mistakes." After she left, I settled in for what I assumed would be a quiet night. The storm had emptied the town. No one was out driving unless absolutely necessary. The online orders had stopped coming in around 5 p.m. I had the store entirely to myself, along with the wind rattling the windows and snow piling against the glass like something trying to bury us. At 10:30 p.m., the power flickered but held. At 11:00 p.m., I locked the door and watched the streetlights dim and brighten in the storm. At 11:47 p.m., the lights went out. The emergency lighting clicked on after a 3-second delay that felt much longer. Dim LED fixtures mounted high on the walls, casting the store in a pale blue glow that made everything look underwater and distant. The computer terminal died with a small electronic whine, taking the inventory system with it. The heating system shut down, and within minutes I could feel the temperature beginning to drop. I found the candles under the counter, old emergency candles in glass jars, the kind that burn for hours, and lit 2 of them, placing them on either side of the register. The warm light helped psychologically, if not practically. The store was silent in a way it never was with power. No hum from the computer, no rattle from the radiators, no subtle vibration from the refrigerator in the staff area. Just wind outside and the creak of old wood settling against the cold. At 12:23 a.m., I heard crying. It was soft, choked, coming from somewhere in the back of the store. Biography section maybe, or local history. A woman's voice, the kind of crying that comes from real fear or real grief, desperate and trying to stay quiet. I stood up from the counter, every muscle tense. The emergency lights didn't reach the back sections. Those aisles were just darkness with vague suggestions of shelves. "Hello?" The crying continued. "Hello? Is someone there?" My hand went to my phone, but the cell signal had dropped to nothing. The storm, probably, or the old building's thick walls. I picked up one of the flashlights from under the counter, testing it. The beam was strong, steady. "Please," the voice called, still crying. "I think I'm locked in. I can't find the door. I don't know what's happening." Every rule I knew said the store was locked after 11. No one should be inside. No customers could have hidden or fallen asleep because there hadn't been any customers during the last hour before closing. I'd been at the counter the entire time and would have seen anyone enter. But what if someone had come in earlier, gone to the bathroom or the back sections, had some kind of medical episode? What if there was actually someone hurt or confused, trapped in the dark? What if this was the one time the paranormal bullshit wasn't active and I let a real person suffer because I was too afraid to investigate? "I'm staff," I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the dead air. "I'm going to come help you, okay? Keep talking so I can find you." I moved away from the counter, flashlight cutting a path through the darkness. The emergency lighting above didn't so much illuminate as suggest the existence of space. Shadows pooled thick between the shelves. "Thank you," the voice said, still crying. "Thank you, I'm in the back. Near the books about presidents, I think. I'm sorry, I know it's late, I just..." Biography section. I navigated the main aisle, past self-help and philosophy, my flashlight beam bouncing off book spines and casting strange, elongated shadows. The crying got louder as I approached. "I'm almost there," I said. "It's okay. We'll get you out." I turned the corner into biography. The aisle was empty, but I could still hear the crying, close now, maybe 15 feet away. I swept the flashlight across the shelves. Nothing. No one crouched between the stacks. No one collapsed on the floor. "Hello?" The voice came from my right, deeper in the section. I took 3 more steps, flashlight leading. The crying had stopped, but I could hear breathing now, shallow, rapid, the sound of someone terrified trying to stay calm. Then the voice said my name. "Ava?" I froze. "Ava, it's me." The voice had changed, no longer crying, no longer panicked, just familiar with that particular tone that carried years of shared history. Inside jokes, landong phone calls. It was my sister's voice. Rachel, who lived in Oregon, who I hadn't physically seen in 18 months. "Ava, I've been so worried about you," the voice continued, still coming from somewhere between the shelves to my right. "You stopped calling, stopped answering emails. Mom said you moved to Vermont, but she didn't know why. Are you okay?" Every rational part of my brain screamed wrongness. Rachel didn't know about the bookstore, didn't know my shift schedule, couldn't possibly be in Vermont during a blizzard without telling me, couldn't be in the store after hours, couldn't... But the voice was perfect. The exact inflection, the slight rasp she got when emotional, the way she always said my name with a slight rise at the end like it was half a question. I wanted desperately to see her, to talk to her, to have someone from my real life, my outside life, break through this isolated nightmare and pull me back to normalcy. The flashlight beam shook in my hand as I moved it across the shelves, and then I saw her, or a silhouette that might have been her, standing between 2 bookcases about 20 feet away, just at the edge of my flashlight's range, the right height, the right general shape. But the details were wrong, too dark, too still like a photograph instead of a person. "I came all this way," the voice said, and now I could see the figure's mouth moving, or something that looked like a mouth moving. I was so worried. "Come here, let me see you. Let me make sure you're okay." Rule 7 surfaced in my memory. If you see a customer browsing after 1:30 a.m., ask them politely to leave. If they do not respond, return to the counter and do not speak to them again. It wasn't 1:30 yet, but the principle was the same. Customers who shouldn't exist, who violated the basic physics of how someone could be in the store, were not to be engaged. But this wasn't a customer. This was my sister, or something wearing her voice, her shape, her name like a costume. "Ava?" The figure took a step forward. "Why won't you answer me? It's Rachel. You know me." I did know her. That was the problem. I knew Rachel well enough to recognize that this thing sounded exactly like her. Too exactly. It had recorded every conversation we'd ever had and learned to replicate her speech patterns perfectly. Like it had read her somehow, the way Mrs. Delacourt said the store read its employees. And if it had read Rachel, my sister who'd never been to Ashford, who had no connection to Hemlock and Hearth, then it must have read her from me. From my memories, my attachments, the things I carried that defined my emotional landscape. It wasn't using Rachel to find me. It was using my knowledge of Rachel to pull me closer. "I need to get back to the counter," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I left something important there." "Don't go." The figure's voice changed. Still Rachel's, but colder now, more insistent. "We haven't talked in so long. Don't you miss me? Don't you want to see your sister?" I was already backing away, keeping the flashlight pointed at the figure but not looking directly at it. Looking at it would make it more real, would cement it in my perception as something that actually existed rather than something the store was projecting. "I'll come back," I lied. "Just let me get my phone. I want to take a picture of us." "You don't need your phone, Ava." The voice was still Rachel's, but the emotional coloring was off now, too flat, too rehearsed. "Just come here. Let me see you. Let me—" I turned and walked quickly back toward the main aisle, not running because running felt like prey behavior, like an invitation to chase. The figure didn't follow. Or if it did, it made no sound. Behind me, I heard something that might have been footsteps or might have been books falling from shelves. Then Rachel's voice again, but this time it was coming from everywhere at once, from the walls and ceiling and floor. "That's all right. I'll wait until you're ready." I made it back to the counter, set the flashlight down with shaking hands, and stood in the small circle of candlelight trying to remember how to breathe normally. The store felt larger in the darkness, the aisles stretching back into impossible distances. The emergency lights flickered once, making the shadows jump. I didn't go back into the aisles for the rest of the shift. At 3:47 a.m., my phone suddenly regained signal and buzzed with a text from Rachel. "Real Rachel in Oregon, 3 time zones away. Weird dream about you tonight. You were in a dark library and something was calling my name. You okay?" I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I'm fine. Just working late. Miss you." The connection between us, the one the store had used to craft its lure, apparently went both directions. At 6:02 a.m., the power came back with a thunk and a hum. The overhead lights blazed on, so bright after hours of dimness that I had to squint. The computer rebooted itself. The radiators began their familiar hissing. Mrs. Delacourt arrived 15 minutes later, struggling through drifts that had piled 3 feet high against the storefront. She took one look at my face and said, "It used someone you love." I nodded. "But you didn't follow it. You didn't speak to it after you realized what it was." "I told it I'd come back." "That doesn't count. Lying to it is allowed, expected even." She began her morning routine, checking the register, organizing receipts, with the calm efficiency of someone for whom my near disaster was simply Tuesday. The store learns us by reading our emotional attachments. The longer you work here, the more it understands about what matters to you. Usually it starts with acquaintances, co-workers, people on the periphery. Using immediate family means it's accelerating. Why? Because you went into the storage room, you read David's journal. You're not content to follow rules. You want to understand the architecture beneath them. That makes you more valuable as a character in its narrative. She looked at me with something like sympathy. "You've passed the threshold, Ava. You're no longer a potential employee who might quit. You're someone it's decided to keep." After the night with Rachel's voice, or what wore her voice like skin, I seriously considered quitting. I drafted the email 3 times, deleted it 3 times, and finally saved it as a draft titled "Emergency Exit Strategy." But I didn't send it. Not because the money was good or because I'd started to think of myself as someone who could handle impossible situations, but because something Mrs. Delacourt had said lodged in my brain like a fishhook. You're no longer a potential employee who might quit. You're someone it's decided to keep. The implication being that quitting might not be as simple as walking away, that the store, having invested time in learning me, reading me, cataloging my fears and attachments, might not be willing to let that narrative thread dangle unresolved. So I stayed, and I was more careful. I followed every rule with religious precision. I didn't investigate sounds. I didn't read from unstickered books. I maintained my position at the counter like it was a military fortification, and I counted down the hours until dawn with the focus of someone defusing a bomb. For 9 shifts, nothing escalated. The store seemed to settle into a waiting pattern. Still active, footsteps in history, books falling in distant aisles, the occasional whisper of pages turning in empty sections, but not aggressive. Like it had made its point and was now giving me time to accept my role in whatever story it was telling. Then came March 7th, and the storm. The weather forecast had been apocalyptic all week, a major nor'easter tracking up the coast, expected to dump 2 feet of snow on Vermont with wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. The governor declared a state of emergency. Schools closed preemptively. The grocery store was ransacked by people stocking up on bread and milk as if we were facing the end times rather than a bad Tuesday. Mrs. Delacourt offered to close the store for the night. No one will be out in this, no deliveries, no online orders that can't wait. You'd be sitting in an empty building during a blizzard, and if the power fails, I'll be fine, I said with more confidence than I felt. I've got flashlights, the emergency lighting, my phone's charged. If it gets bad, I'll leave early. She studied me with those sharp eyes that always seemed to read 3 layers deeper than the surface. You want to be here, during the storm, when the building will be most active. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. I need to know what happens when it's fully unleashed. When there are no customers, no delivery people, no possibility of normal interruptions, just me and whatever this place is. That's the kind of thinking that trapped David Crane, the kind that made Sarah Locke start hearing questions no one asked. I'm not trying to understand it, I'm trying to face it. The distinction felt important, though I wasn't entirely sure I could articulate why. There's a difference between studying something and surviving it. Mrs. Delacourt was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose there is. She pulled on her coat, the heavy one again, and paused at the door. If it becomes too much, if the boundaries start dissolving, go to the front door and wait. Don't go deeper into the store. Don't try to hide in the back rooms. The front door is the threshold, the liminal space. It's the hardest place for it to fully manifest. Do you understand? I understand. She left, and the storm swallowed her taillights within seconds. By 10 p.m., the world outside had disappeared. Not just darkness, but complete whiteout. Snow falling so thick and fast that the streetlights were just vague orange smudges in a wall of white. The wind screamed around the building, finding every gap and crack, making the old structure groan like a ship in a gale. At 10:52 p.m., the power failed. This time, even the emergency lights didn't come on. The battery backup was dead, or the storm had damaged something, or the building had simply decided that tonight would be conducted in authentic darkness. I lit the emergency candles and pulled out my flashlight, creating a small island of light at the counter. At 11:00 p.m., I locked the front door, though it felt ceremonial. No one was coming to knock tonight. No one could even reach the building through the drifts. At 11:34 p.m., the store began to change. It started with sounds, footsteps in multiple aisles simultaneously. History, horror, self-help, children's, all walking in rhythm, all browsing, all impossibly present. Then the whisper of pages turning, dozens of books being read at once, a susurrus that rose and fell like breathing. The temperature dropped fast enough that I could watch my breath cloud. The candle flames bent horizontal in a wind that shouldn't exist inside a closed building. I kept my position at the counter, flashlights sweeping across the store, trying to maintain visual confirmation that the aisles were still where they should be, that the mezzanine above wasn't doing anything geometrically impossible. But the darkness was different tonight. Thicker. My flashlight beam seemed to stop after 10 feet, as if the darkness past that point was solid, resistant to illumination. At 12:17 a.m., the computer terminal turned on. Not the whole system, just the monitor, glowing pale blue in the darkness, no tower running, no power to the building, just the screen illuminating itself with impossible electricity. The inventory software loaded itself, scrolling through entries. Then the catalog changed. Instead of book titles, the screen showed entries I'd never seen. The Clerk Who Stayed After Hours genre, horror, tragedy status in progress. Current Chapter 7 of 9, The Girl Who Broke Rule 3 genre, gothic status, archived. Last modified 1991, Ava Carter, 10 p.m. 6 a.m. Genre undefined status. In progress, current Chapter 7 of. Below my entry, a prompt appeared. Scan barcode to confirm inventory status. A barcode scanner sat next to the monitor, its red light blinking expectantly. I didn't touch it. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I turned slowly, keeping my back to the counter. Flashlight cutting arcs through the dark. Figures stood in the aisles. Not solid, not quite visible, but present enough that my flashlight caught them. Shadows shaped like people, standing too still, facing the shelves as if reading. There were 6, maybe 8 positioned throughout the store like customers frozen mid-browse. As I watched, one of them moved, a slow turn of the head toward me, features indistinct but definitely looking, definitely aware. The overhead speakers crackled to life, producing sound with no power source. Instead of the usual jazz, they broadcast whispers. Dozens of voices reading aloud in unison, snippets from different books bleeding into each other. Walked through the narrow aisles where words wait like predators. Chapter 7, in which she realizes the shelves have no end. The protagonist, unable to leave, accepts her role in the store that remembers everyone who ever worked between its. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the whispers didn't come from the speakers. They came from everywhere, from the walls, from inside my own skull. The monitor refreshed again. New arrivals, awaiting catalog. A list appeared. Ava Carter's sister, voice recording Ava Carter's childhood home. Architectural memory, Ava Carter's first love. Archived correspondence, Ava Carter. Biographical entry. Incomplete, scan to finalize. The barcode scanner's light blinked faster. The figures in the aisles began to move, stepping closer, their movements synchronized like a choreographed dance. They weren't walking so much as flowing, gliding through spaces that shouldn't connect, appearing closer with each position shift. Rule 7. If you see a customer browsing after 1:30 a.m., ask them politely to leave. But there were too many, and they weren't browsing, they were advancing, and the clock I noticed had stopped at 12:47. Time wasn't progressing normally. The mezzanine railing creaked, and I looked up. More figures stood along the balcony, leaning over the railing, watching. One of them might have been David Crane, the right height, the right general build for the photo I'd seen in his journal. Another might have been Sarah Locke or Miriam Hollis or any of the other employees who'd stayed too long or understood too much. They were cataloged here, stored, shelved like books, accessible when the building needed to reference their narratives. The store was trying to finish my story, to scan me, catalog me, add me permanently to its collection so I could be read and reread, manifested during power outages and storms, Another shadow customer browsing eternally through the stacks. Scan required to process inventory. The prompt on the monitor pulsed. Mrs. Delacourt's voice echoed in my memory. The front door is the threshold. It's the hardest place for it to fully manifest. But between me and the front door were the figures, the shadow customers, the archived employees. At least a dozen now, forming a loose semicircle that tightened with each passing second. I had two choices: try to fight through them to reach the door, or give the building what it wanted and scan myself into permanent inventory. Then I remembered something else, something David had written in his journal. This building feeds on attention and repetition. Once you start treating it like a story, you're in it. The store wanted me to participate in its narrative, to play the protagonist trying to escape, or the doomed employee accepting her fate, or the final girl survivor barely making it to dawn. It wanted me to scan the barcode, or run for the door, or hide in the back rooms, all narrative choices, all story beats it could incorporate. What it didn't expect was for me to reject the story entirely. The figures were less than 15 feet away now, close enough that I could see details that shouldn't exist. Faces that flickered between identities, hands that blurred at the edges like smeared text. I walked away from the counter, not toward the door, not toward the back rooms, toward the mezzanine stairs, toward the narrow hallway that led to the storage room and the basement door. The whispers increased in volume, confused, trying to redirect me. The protagonist realizes her mistake, returns to the safety of, makes her final stand at. I ignored them. The hallway was pitch black, my flashlight cutting a tunnel through darkness that felt actively resistant. The storage room door was closed but unlocked. I passed it. The basement door stood at the end of the hall, deadbolt in place, sealed like it had been for decades. I knew from David's journal, from Mrs. Delacourt's warnings, from every horror story ever told, that opening this door was the worst possible choice. That whatever was down there was the source, the core, the thing that had made this building conscious in the first place. But the store's narrative expected me to avoid it, expected me to fear it. So I pulled the deadbolt. The door swung open on silent hinges. Below, stairs descended into absolute darkness. Not the darkness of the unlit space, but the darkness of negation, of an absence so complete it seemed to pull at light itself. I could hear breathing. Slow, patient, vast. The sound of something that had been waiting for over a century. From behind me, the whispers went silent. The footsteps stopped. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. The store was holding its breath. I walked to the emergency breaker panel beside the basement door, the master panel that controlled every electrical system in the building. Mrs. Delacourt had shown me where it was during training, mentioned it only for dire emergencies. The shadow figures appeared at the end of the hallway, blocking the exit, but they didn't advance. They stood frozen, watching, uncertain for the first time since I'd known this place was aware. I raised my flashlight, found the main breakers, and began flipping them off. Not on, off. Every circuit, every backup system, every emergency light. I killed the building's electrical systems completely, plunging Hemlock and Hearth into total darkness. For 3 seconds, nothing existed. No light, no sound, no sense of up or down or the floor beneath my feet, just void. Then movement in that void, the sound of pages turning, thousands of them all at once, wind that wasn't wind rushing past me with the force of words being read at incredible speed. Hot breath on the back of my neck that smelled like old paper and ink. Something vast moved in the darkness and I felt it brush past me. Not physical exactly, but present. A thing made of story and repetition and accumulated narrative weight, so close I could have reached out and touched its pages. It could have taken me then, could have filed me away in whatever space, Between spaces, it kept its incomplete stories. But I'd rejected the narrative, walked toward the threat instead of away, shut off the systems that let it manifest visually, reducing everything to pure potential. Pure darkness where all stories existed simultaneously and therefore none existed completely. I'd made myself illegible. The breathing in the darkness faded, the wind that wasn't wind settled. The sense of vast presence receded, pulling back into whatever basement space housed it. And then, gradually, impossibly light. Not from the electrical systems, those were dead. But the weak gray light of approaching dawn leaking through the frosted front windows, diluting the darkness inch by inch. The shadow figures were gone. The monitor was dark. The store was just a store again, cold, damaged by the storm, filled with books that were just books and shelves that were just wood. I stood in the hallway for a long time, waiting for my hands to stop shaking. The storm had blown itself out by dawn, leaving Ashford under 3 feet of snow and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The town plow didn't reach our street until almost 10 a.m., carving a single narrow channel through drifts that had buried parked cars and first-floor windows. Mrs. Delacourt arrived at 10:47, struggling through the piled snow with a thermos of coffee and an expression that cycled between relief and resignation. She found me sitting on the floor behind the counter, wrapped in my coat, surrounded by dead candles and the faint smell of ozone that lingered after the building's electrical systems had been killed and forcibly restarted. She didn't ask what happened. She looked at the dark monitor, at the basement door hanging open at the end of the back hallway, at the breaker panel with every switch in the off position. And she understood. "You turned it off," she said finally. "I killed the power, completely made it so dark that even it couldn't see. And then it touched me, or moved past me, or considered taking me." I looked up at her, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. But I'd broken the story, gone off script, made myself into a character it couldn't parse. So it let me go. Mrs. Delacourt set down her thermos and moved slowly through the store, checking sections, running her hand along shelves like she was reading Braille. In the increasing daylight, everything looked aggressively normal. Just an old bookstore after a rough night, nothing sinister, nothing aware. But we both knew better. "The building will need repairs," she said eventually. "The electrical system sustained damage during the surge. Some of the inventory will need to be reshelved. The basement door," she paused, "should be locked, always locked. I didn't go down. I know. If you had, you wouldn't be here." She returned to the counter, picked up her thermos, and poured coffee into the lid cup with practiced precision. "Ava, what you did last night was either very brave or very foolish, and I'm not sure which interpretation concerns me more. I couldn't let it finish the story, couldn't let it scan me into inventory. So instead you walked toward the source, toward the thing in the basement that I've spent 34 years making sure no one approaches." She handed me the coffee. It was still hot, tasted like chicory and honey and normal mornings when bookstores were just places that sold books. "You rejected the narrative it was trying to write, which is the most dangerous thing you can do. Because now it knows you're not just another employee following rules. You're someone who understands the architecture well enough to sabotage it. Is that bad? I don't know yet." She sank into one of the reading chairs, looking older than I'd ever seen her. Small and tired and carrying weight no one should have to carry. People who sabotage it either escape permanently or become so deeply entangled they can never leave. David thought he could understand it and stay safe. He was wrong. But you're not trying to understand. You're trying to fight. I'm trying to survive. Yes. And survival might be enough. She finished her coffee, set the cup aside. I'm giving you a week off, paid. You need distance from this place, and it needs time to process what happened, to recalibrate. When you come back, if you come back, things will be different. Different how? It will either accept that you're a character it can't control and settle into a wary coexistence, or it will escalate, try harder to incorporate you, become more aggressive in its attempts to finish your story. She stood, collecting her thermos. The week will tell me which path it's choosing. The building talks in its way, through patterns, through which books fall, through what appears in the catalog. I'll watch, I'll listen, and I'll let you know if it's safe to return. She left me sitting there in the morning light, surrounded by books and silence and the lingering sense that I'd won a battle but had no idea about the war. I slept for 16 hours straight when I got home. Dreamless, absolute sleep that felt like my consciousness had simply shut down for maintenance. When I woke, it was Wednesday afternoon and my phone had 12 texts from Liam. Are you okay? Heard the storm was bad. Mrs. D said you're taking time off. Ava, seriously, are you okay? I responded, I'm fine, just tired. Storm was intense. His reply came immediately. Can I see you? Coffee at the diner? 20 minutes later, I sat across from him in a booth by the window, watching him try to figure out how to ask what he wanted to ask. Finally, he just said it. You went into the basement, didn't you? No, just to the door. Jesus Christ, Ava. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of pure anxiety. Do you have any idea what Mrs. Delacourt says is down there? What David wrote about? I didn't go in, I needed to make a point, to the building, that I wasn't following its script. Liam stared at me like I'd announced I'd decided to take up base jumping without a parachute. You made a point, to a building, by approaching the one space everyone who's ever worked there agrees should never be opened. It worked. This time. It worked this time. Ava, you can't... He stopped, lowered his voice as the waitress passed with a coffee pot. You can't treat this like something you can outwit. It's not a puzzle. It's not a story with rules you can exploit. It's something old and strange and fundamentally other, and the only reason anyone survives working there is by staying small and uninteresting and beneath its notice. Well, I'm not beneath its notice anymore, so I need to find another strategy. The strategy is quit. The strategy is get the hell out of Ashford and never think about that bookstore again. I sipped my coffee, which was terrible but hot and real and from the diner where nothing supernatural had ever happened. I can't. Why not? Because Mrs. Delacourt had said I'd passed the threshold. Because I'd read David's journal and seen my own future illustrated in a children's book. Because the store knew my sister's voice, my childhood home, the shape of my first heartbreak. Because I'd touched something in the darkness that was made of story and symbol and accumulated words. And it had touched me back. Because I wasn't sure anymore where Ava the person ended and Ava the character began. Because I need the money, I lied. Liam didn't believe me, but he let it drop. We finished our coffee, talked about safe things, his thesis, the weather, whether the diner's pie had gotten worse or we'd just gotten older. And parted with a hug that lasted slightly too long, like he was afraid he wouldn't see me again. Maybe he was right to be afraid. The week passed slowly. I wrote, or tried to, opened my novel document and stared at the protagonist who discovered her apartment was haunted and couldn't figure out how to make the story feel true anymore. I knew too much now about how real hauntings worked. They weren't dramatic or cinematic. They were bureaucratic, procedural, exhausting. They wore you down through repetition and small violations until you couldn't remember what normal had felt like. On Friday, Mrs. Delacourt called. The building has decided, she said without preamble. It's calm, quieter than it's been in months. Some of the books that were in the storage room have reshelved themselves in general inventory, which hasn't happened in 15 years. The basement door is locked again, though I didn't lock it. It sealed itself. Is that good? I think it's acceptance. I think you scared it, Ava. Reminded it that stories can be interrupted, that protagonists can refuse their roles. It's not used to that. It's used to completing narratives, filing them away, moving to the next one. A pause. When you come back, if you come back, I think it will leave you alone. Mostly. It will test you occasionally, but it won't try to catalog you again. You've become illegible, and illegible things can't be shelved properly. What does that make me? If I'm not an employee who follows rules and I'm not a character in its story, a witness, perhaps, someone who's seen it clearly and survived, that's rare enough to be valuable. Rare enough that it might want to keep you around just to see what you do next. She gave me the weekend to decide, said to call Sunday night if I wanted my shifts back. I spent Saturday reading David's journal again, cover to cover, looking for warnings I'd missed. The final entry still gave me chills. Understanding makes you complicit. Ignorance might keep you alive. But I'd gone past understanding into something else. Confrontation, rejection, survival not through following rules but through breaking the script entirely. Sunday night I called. I'll be back Tuesday, I told Mrs. Delacourt. Good, she said and hung up. My first shift back was anticlimactic. The store was just a store. Books on shelves, creaky floors, radiators that hissed. I followed the rules out of habit more than fear, locked the door at 11, didn't investigate the footsteps in history at 12:34. But I noticed changes. The unstickered book that had been in philosophy was now in the checkout counter's drawer, wrapped in brown paper and labeled "Do Not Shelve. Reference only." As if the building had decided it trusted me enough to know it existed, but not enough to let me read it. The storage room door was locked again, but the key I'd found was still in my pocket. A test, maybe, or an acknowledgement that I had access now for better or worse. And the children's book, the one that had shown me my illustrated future, was gone. Not reshelved, not in storage, just gone, as if that particular narrative thread had been deleted from the catalog. At 3:23 a.m. I heard something fall in the biography section. Against my better judgment, I investigated. A single book lay on the floor, face up. A Local History of Ashford, published in 1967. It was open to a chapter about the town's oldest buildings. There was a photograph of Hemlock and Hearth, dated 1932. The storefront looked identical to now, but standing in front of it were three people. A man in a suit who must have been the owner, and two younger people in work clothes. Employees, presumably. I looked closer at the employees. One of them might have been David Crane. The other might have been Sarah Locke. But the photograph was from 1932, decades before either of them were born. The building had been telling stories about certain employees for so long that they'd become archetypes, recurring characters who appeared across decades, wearing different faces but playing the same roles. The keeper, the one who reads too much, the one who refuses. I was becoming an archetype too, the one who walked toward the basement and survived. I closed the book, reshelved it, and returned to the counter. At 6:02 a.m., Mrs. Delacourt arrived. She looked at me at the store and nodded slowly. "Welcome back," she said. "Thanks. How was your shift?" "Quiet," I said. "Almost normal." "Good." She began her morning routine, checking the register, organizing receipts. "Ava, I need to tell you something. I've been the day manager here for 34 years. I'm 73 years old. I won't be doing this forever." My stomach dropped. "Are you okay? I'm fine, just tired." And I wanted you to know that when I eventually retire, the building will need someone who understands it, someone who's survived it, someone illegible enough that it can't fully control them but present enough that it trusts them to maintain the boundaries. She was talking about me taking over, becoming the next Mrs. Delacourt, the next guardian who spent decades managing rules and warning new employees and carrying the weight of a building that was more story than structure. "I'm not ready for that," I said quietly. "No one ever is. But you're here, and you survived, and that makes you qualified whether you want to be or not." She put on her coat. "Think about it. You have time. I'm not retiring tomorrow, but eventually someone needs to take over, and it might as well be someone who's already looked into the basement and walked away." She left. I sat there in the morning light, surrounded by books that were just books and others that were something more, and wondered if surviving had been a victory or just the end of one chapter in a much longer story. 6 weeks later, the help wanted sign went back in the window. Not because I'd quit. I was still working nights, still following rules, still navigating the uneasy truce I'd established with whatever consciousness resided in Hemlock and Hearth's walls. But Mrs. Delacourt needed weekend coverage, and I couldn't work 7 nights a week without losing what was left of my sanity. "We'll be selective," she told me over coffee at the diner. "Someone steady, someone who can follow instructions, someone who—" She paused. "Someone who has the right combination of skepticism and imagination to survive the first few weeks." "You mean someone like me?" "God, no. You were a terrible hire." But she smiled when she said it, taking the edge off. "You lasted because you're stubborn and analytical, and willing to break rules in order to preserve larger patterns. That's rare. Most people either follow every instruction blindly or rebel against all of them equally. Both approaches fail eventually. So what are we looking for? Someone curious but cautious. Someone who needs the job enough to stay past the first incident, but not so desperate they'll compromise safety for a paycheck." She stirred sugar into her coffee with methodical precision. "Someone who reads a lot. Readers understand that stories have rules and that breaking them has consequences." 3 candidates applied. The first was a retired accountant who wanted something to keep busy. Mrs. Delacourt politely rejected him after he mentioned he didn't believe in all that supernatural nonsense. The second was a college dropout who seemed promising until he asked if he could stream while working and whether the store had good Wi-Fi. Also rejected. The third was Maya Torres, 22, with a degree in English literature, 6 months of unemployment, and student loans that made my rent look reasonable by comparison. She had good references from a bookstore in Burlington, a quiet intensity that suggested she took things seriously, and the slightly haunted look of someone who'd recently had their life plans demolished by circumstances beyond their control. "Why do you want a night shift?" Mrs. Delacourt asked during the interview while I reshelved nearby, pretending not to listen. "Honestly, because I'm nocturnal anyway. I do my best thinking after midnight. And the idea of being alone with books for 6 hours sounds like the opposite of a problem." Maya smiled, self-deprecating. "Plus, the pay is really good for retail, and I'm guessing that's because something about this job is harder than standard bookstore work." Mrs. Delacourt glanced at me, and I gave a tiny nod. Anyone who walked into the interview assuming the job would be difficult was already ahead of where I'd started. "When can you begin?" "Whenever you need me. Friday night, 9:30. Ava will train you." On Friday, I arrived early to help prepare. Mrs. Delacourt had printed new orientation materials, safety procedures, inventory protocols, the standard retail paperwork, and of course the rule card. It had been updated. Hemlock and Hearth. Night Clerk Rules. Rule 1. Lock the front door at 11 all p.m. sharp. Do not open it for anyone after that, even if they claim to have forgotten something inside. Rule 3. If you hear footsteps in the history aisle after midnight, do not investigate. That section is closed at night. Rule 5. Do not read aloud from any book that does not have a price sticker. Rule 7. If you see a customer browsing after 1:30 a.m., ask them politely to leave. If they do not respond, return to the counter and do not speak to them again. Rule 9. If you ever see yourself still shelving books after you've gone home, do not come back for your next shift. The new rule had been added in Mrs. Delacourt's precise handwriting, then laminated like the others. Rule 9. My rule. The one derived from David's journal, from my experience in the storage room, from the children's book that had shown me my illustrated future. It was a warning I'd earned, and now it was part of the official protocol, a breadcrumb left for whoever came after me. Maya arrived at 9:33, 3 minutes late, apologizing for underestimating how long it took to find parking on the narrow street. She wore jeans, a flannel shirt, and an expression of determined cheerfulness that I recognized from my own first night, the look of someone who needed this job to work out and was willing to overlook any reasonable concerns to make that happen. "So," she said, looking around the store with obvious appreciation, "this place is amazing. How old is the building?" 1890s, I said. "It's been a bookstore since 1894. "That's so cool. I love old buildings. They have personality, you know." Personality, yes. That's one word for it. I walked her through the basics: register operation, online order processing, where to find packing materials, bathroom location. Standard retail orientation, no different from any other bookstore. She picked it up quickly, taking notes on her phone, asking smart questions about inventory codes and shipping procedures. At 10:47, Mrs. Delacourt prepared to leave. She handed Maya the rule card with the same casual gravity she'd used with me 3 months earlier. Night shift protocols. They'll seem unusual, but they're important. Follow them precisely. Maya read the card, and I watched her expression cycle through the exact sequence I'd gone through: amusement, confusion, skepticism, uncertain humor. This is like a creative writing exercise, right? A fun bookstore tradition? Mrs. Delacourt looked at me. After a moment, I said, "They're serious. Follow them exactly, especially in the first few weeks. Don't improvise, don't test them, don't assume they're metaphorical. But they're so weirdly specific. If you see yourself shelving books, how would that even—" She stopped, noticing our expressions. "Wait, you're not kidding." "No. But that doesn't make sense. These are instructions for, what, ghosts? Parallel dimensions? They're instructions for staying safe," Mrs. Delacourt said quietly. "The building is old. It has patterns. The rules help you navigate those patterns without complications." Maya looked at the card again, then at the store, then back at us. I could see the decision happening in real time. Treat this like hazing and risk offending her new employers, or play along and risk feeling foolish. She chose the third option: tentative acceptance with significant skepticism. "Okay, I'll follow them. But I reserve the right to be confused about why they exist." "That's fair," I said. "Confusion is safer than certainty anyway." Mrs. Delacourt left, locking the door behind her with that same definitive sound that marked the beginning of every night shift. Maya and I stood at the counter, and I felt the building settle around us. Not threatening, not yet, just aware, noticing the new presence, cataloging her patterns, beginning the slow process of reading her the way it had read me. "So," Maya said, trying to sound casual, "has anything actually weird ever happened here? Or are the rules just like atmospheric?" I thought about the figure at the door with no footprints. The footsteps in history that multiplied when Liam read from the unstickered book. Rachel's voice in the biography section, perfect and wrong. The shadow customers during the storm, the illustrated version of myself. The thing in the basement that breathed like a sleeping dragon made of pages. Things happen, I said carefully. Usually they're manageable if you follow protocols. The rules exist because they work, not because they're decorative. That's deeply unsettling as an answer. Yeah. We worked in companionable silence for a while. I showed her how to process online orders, where to find the packing materials and the system for recording inventory adjustments. Normal work helped establish normalcy, a baseline against which the abnormal could eventually be measured. At 11 p.m. I had Maya lock the front door. She turned the deadbolt with a solid click, and I saw her glance at Rule 1 on the laminated card. Do people actually knock after 11? Sometimes. And we just don't let them in, even if they seem like they legitimately forgot something? Especially then. She wanted to ask more, but something in my tone suggested the topic was closed. Instead, she returned to the counter and pulled out a book from her bag. A collection of Shirley Jackson stories, appropriately enough. Is it okay if I read between tasks? That's what I do. The next 2 hours passed quietly. Maya read, occasionally looking up to watch the store with the hypervigilance of someone in a new environment. I processed orders and tried not to telegraph my own tension. The building was too quiet, too settled, and in my experience, that meant it was planning something. At 12:19 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps in the history aisle. Measured, unhurried, accompanied by the faint sound of books being moved. Maya heard it too. She set down her book, head tilted, listening. Is someone else here? No. But I hear... She started to stand. Rule 3, I said quickly. Don't investigate the history aisle after midnight. That doesn't make sense. If someone got locked in, no one got locked in. The store was empty when we locked up. I kept my voice level, authoritative, the way Mrs. Delacourt had with me. That section is closed at night. The sounds you're hearing are not something you need to investigate. Maya stared at me, trying to decide if I was serious. The footsteps continued, clear and distinct, now joined by what sounded like pages turning. Ava, I'm not trying to be difficult, but I can hear someone back there. If this is some kind of test, it's not a test. It's the building. It makes sounds. Follow the rule and stay at the counter. For a long moment, I thought she might ignore me. Might walk back to history to prove that nothing supernatural existed, that the sounds were just pipes or wind or some mundane explanation. The same impulse that had driven Liam to read from the unstickered book, the same curiosity that had led me to the storage room. But then she looked at the rule card, at the specific wording, do not investigate, and something in her expression shifted. Not acceptance exactly, but a decision to defer judgment. Okay, she said quietly, sitting back down. I'm staying at the counter. The footsteps continued for another 7 minutes, then stopped abruptly mid-step as if someone had simply turned off the recording. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sounds had been. Maya didn't pick up her book again. She sat very still, hands folded on the counter, breathing carefully. That wasn't pipes. No. And you're not going to explain what it was. I can't. I don't fully understand it myself. I looked at her directly, trying to find the words Mrs. Delacourt had never quite given me. This building has been here a long time. It's accumulated patterns, echoes. Things that repeat because they've been repeated so many times they've worn grooves into reality. The rules help you avoid engaging with those patterns. Engaging makes them stronger, makes them notice you, makes them... I stopped, realizing I was already saying too much. Makes them what? makes them interested in including you. Maya was quiet for a long time. Then, I really need this job. I know. But I also really don't want to be included in whatever that was. Then follow the rules. Exactly. Don't test them, don't try to understand them, don't treat them like suggestions. They're the accumulated wisdom of everyone who's survived working nights here. She nodded slowly, picked up her book, then set it down again without opening it. Can I ask you something? Have you ever broken the rules? I thought about the storage room, the basement door, the night I killed all the power and walked into absolute darkness. Yes. What happened? I survived, but I don't recommend it. I pulled out my phone, checking the time, 12:41 a.m. Still 5 hours until dawn. The building rewards consistency and punishes curiosity. As long as you're predictable, as long as you follow the protocols, it mostly leaves you alone. Start deviating, start investigating, and it interprets that as interest, as permission to get closer. Permission to do what? To read you. To learn what matters to you, your fears, your attachments, the people you love, and once it knows those things, it can use them. Maya's face had gone pale. Use them how? To make you participate, to pull you deeper into whatever story it's telling. I gestured around the store. Every book here is a narrative, thousands of them, all stored in the same space, all bleeding into each other over decades. The building doesn't just house stories anymore, it's become one. And stories need characters. And the rules keep you from becoming a character. They keep you from becoming a major character. You're still in the story, everyone who works here is. But your background, a minor role. Someone who walks through a scene and exits without affecting the plot. That's survivable. She picked up the rule card again, reading each entry with new focus. When she reached Rule 9, she stopped. If you see yourself still shelving books after you've gone home, don't come back for your next shift. That's the newest one. Did someone see themselves like a doppelganger? Several people over the years. It's a sign that the building has cataloged you so completely it can manifest a copy. A version of you that exists in its narrative independent of your physical presence. I watched her process this. If that happens, it means you've been here too long, become too entangled. The you that shows up for shifts and the you that exists in the store's story have started to separate. That's insane. Yes, but you believe it. I've seen things that removed belief from the equation. Now I just operate on evidence and survival protocols. Maya set the card down carefully as it might bite her. How long have you worked here? 3 months. And in 3 months you've seen enough to believe in... What? Ghosts? Hauntings? I don't know what to call it. The building isn't exactly haunted in the traditional sense. It's more like it's saturated with narrative potential. So many stories have been told, read, and stored here that the boundary between fiction and reality has gotten thin. I paused, trying to find an analogy she might accept. You know how a word stops making sense if you repeat it too many times? How did it become just sounds, disconnected from meaning? Semantic satiation. Right. This is the opposite. The building has repeated story patterns so many times that they've gained too much meaning. They've become more real than they should be, started manifesting independent of their source texts. Maya looked around the store, at the crooked aisles, the overstuffed shelves, the mezzanine balcony overlooking everything. Why would Mrs. Delacourt keep this place open? If it's dangerous, someone has to manage it. If the building were empty, if no one maintained the boundaries and updated the rules, it would get worse. The patterns would grow stronger, start reaching beyond the building itself. I'd never articulated this before, but saying it aloud made a horrible kind of sense. Mrs. Delacourt isn't running a bookstore anymore. She's running containment. And people like us, we're not really employees. We're wardens. Yeah. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. At 1:47 a.m., Maya went to the bathroom. While she was gone, a book fell from the shelf in the children's section, a soft thump that echoed in the quiet store. I walked back to check, flashlight in hand, moving carefully through the narrow aisles. The book lay face up on the floor, a picture book I'd never seen before, though I'd shelved this section a dozen times. The cover showed a drawing of a young woman with dark hair and brown skin standing in a bookstore, looking confused. The woman looked remarkably like Maya. I picked up the book carefully, feeling that familiar cold certainty in my stomach. The title read, "The Girl Who Asked Too Many Questions." No author listed, no publication date, no price sticker. I flipped to the first page. The illustration showed the same bookstore interior I'd seen before, the one that looked disturbingly like hemlock and hearth. The young woman stood at the counter reading a card. The text below said, "Maya thought the rules were silly. She was smart and curious and smart. Curious people always need to understand why. But some rules exist not to explain the world, but to keep you from being explained by it." I turned the page. The illustration showed the woman walking down an aisle toward distant shadows. The text read, "On her first night, Maya heard footsteps where no footsteps should be." I should investigate, she thought. I should prove there's nothing to fear. The next page showed the woman closer to the shadows, which had begun to take shape, multiple figures watching. But the store doesn't fear investigation. It welcomes it. It invites you deeper, shows you more until you've seen so much you can't unsee it. Until you've become part of what you were trying to understand. I closed the book quickly, fighting the urge to read to the end, to see how Maya's story concluded in the building's narrative. Because reading it might make it true, might cement that particular plot thread, might give the building permission to treat Maya exactly how it had treated the illustrated version. Behind me, I heard the bathroom door open, Maya returning. I had maybe 10 seconds to decide, hide the book, pretend I hadn't seen it, maintain the illusion that she was safe if she just followed the rules, or show her exactly how much danger she was in, how the building had already started cataloging her, writing her into its collection. The truth might scare her into quitting, but lies would get her trapped. I turned as she approached, the book still in my hands. "What's that?" she asked. "Something you need to see." I showed her the cover first, watched her expression shift from curiosity to confusion to dawning horror as she recognized herself in the illustration. That looks like me. It's you, or a version of you the building is writing." I opened to the first page, let her read the text. "This appeared tonight. While you were in the bathroom, the store is already trying to decide what kind of character you'll be." Maya's hands shook as she turned the pages, reading ahead to illustrations I'd deliberately avoided. I watched her face as she saw herself drawn deeper into the store, saw the shadows gaining definition. Saw herself, in the final illustration, standing at a shelf with her hand on a book, while her reflection in a nearby window showed someone else entirely. The last page had no text, just an illustration of the bookstore at night, empty except for shadows arranged like customers browsing, and a single figure behind the counter who might have been Maya, or might have been one of the shadows wearing her face. She closed the book with a sharp snap. "I quit. That's fair. I mean it. I don't care how good the pay is. I'm not staying in a building that's writing creepy picture books about me after one shift. I understand, but Maya," I paused, choosing words carefully. "You should wait until morning. Leave when Mrs. Delacourt arrives, when it's daylight, when the building is dormant. Leaving in the middle of the night, especially after seeing this. You think something will happen if I leave now. I think the building interprets abrupt departures as part of the story. The scared protagonist flees into the night. That's a narrative beat it recognizes, and it might try to complete the pattern. As opposed to what? Staying until dawn and then leaving politely? Exactly. Boring endings are safer. If you finish your shift, collect your pay, and quit professionally, you're just an employee who didn't work out. Forgettable. But if you run, I gestured at the book, you become the character who tried to escape, and that's a much more interesting story. Maya looked at the front door, at the darkness beyond the frosted windows, at the store that suddenly seemed to have grown larger and more labyrinthine. You're saying I'm trapped here until 6 a.m. I'm saying you're safer here, following the rules until dawn. Then you walk away and never come back, and eventually the building forgets you were anything more than a minor character who appeared for one scene. And if I leave now? I thought about Thomas Brennan, who disappeared in 1981, about Sarah Locke in her care facility still hearing questions from 2 states away, about the postcard Mrs. Delacour had received, still in the stacks, can't find the exit. I don't know. But I know that people who make dramatic exits from Hemlock and Hearth don't always make it home. Maya was quiet for a long time, weighing her options, calculating risks with the same analytical intensity she'd brought to learning the inventory system. Finally, she nodded. I'll stay until morning, but I'm keeping my eyes on the door, and if anything tries to stop me from leaving at 6, I'm going to start screaming and not stop until someone calls the police. That's fair. We returned to the counter. I took the picture book with us, placing it in the drawer with the wrapped, unstickered volume. Another artifact for the store's collection. Another narrative that hadn't quite completed. The next 3 hours were the longest of Maya's life, I'm sure. She didn't read, didn't relax, just sat rigid at the counter with her phone clutched in one hand and her car keys in the other. Every sound made her flinch. Every creak of floorboards or hiss of radiators drew her attention. I tried to make it easier by being deliberately boring, processing orders, organizing receipts, talking about mundane bookstore logistics. Anything to create an atmosphere of normalcy, to signal to the building that this was an unremarkable shift, with an unremarkable employee who would be unremarkably leaving. At 2:34 a.m., we heard footsteps on the mezzanine. Maya tensed, but I kept my focus on the computer screen. Ignore it. Just the building settling. There's something walking up there. There's always something walking up there. It's testing you, seeing if you'll investigate, if you'll engage. Don't give it the satisfaction. The footsteps continued for 11 minutes, pacing back and forth along the mezzanine railing. Then they stopped, and we heard nothing else for the rest of the shift. At 5:47 a.m., gray dawn light began filtering through the windows. The store felt different in that light, smaller, more ordinary, like a spell breaking. At 6:03 a.m., Mrs. Delacour arrived, shaking snow off her coat. She took one look at Maya's expression and sighed. You're quitting. Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry, but I can't work here. Did something happen? I pulled out the picture book and handed it to Mrs. Delacour. She flipped through it with no visible surprise, just a weary recognition. It's been a while since it did this. Usually it waits at least a week before starting to manifest personalized narratives. Is that bad? Maya asked. It means the building found you particularly interesting. Probably because you're genuinely curious. The kind of mind that seeks patterns and answers. Those are dangerous traits here. She closed the book and added it to her own bag. I'll file this with the others. You're free to go, Maya. I'll process your resignation and mail your check for tonight's hours. Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't. Don't apologize. You're making the smart choice. Mrs. Delacourt glanced at me. "Walk her to her car, Ava. Make sure she gets out safely." I accompanied Maya through the front door into the bitter morning cold. Her car was parked 2 buildings down, covered in a thin layer of snow. As she unlocked it, she turned back to me. "How do you do it? How do you work there night after night, knowing what it is?" "Carefully," I said, "and with the understanding that some jobs aren't really about the work. They're about managing something that would be worse if left unmanaged." "You sound like Mrs. Delacourt." "Yeah. I'm starting to realize that might be inevitable." Maya got in her car and started the engine. Through the window, she said, "Be careful, Ava. Don't let it finish writing you." "I'll try." She drove away, and I watched until her taillights disappeared around the corner. Then I returned to the bookstore where Mrs. Delacourt was updating the employee ledger. "She lasted 4 hours, the older woman said without looking up. "That's actually better than average for people who see their illustrated futures." She was smart, knew when to quit. "Yes?" Mrs. Delacourt closed the ledger, looked at me with those sharp, tired eyes. "The position is still open. Weekend nights. Are you interested in additional hours?" I should have said no. Should have recognized this as the trap it was. More hours meant more exposure, more entanglement, more risk of becoming so deeply written into the building's narrative that I'd end up like Mrs. Delacourt, managing it for decades because I couldn't leave. But I thought about what would happen if no one took the shifts. About the building without proper supervision, its patterns growing stronger, its boundaries expanding. About the next Maya who might walk in and not have anyone to warn her. "I'll take the shifts," I said, "until you find someone else." Mrs. Delacourt nodded, unsurprised. "I'll update the schedule." As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door, her hand in that familiar position on the frame, steadying herself against something invisible. "Ava, do you know why I really keep this place open? Why I spent 34 years managing something that most people would just burn down and salt the earth?" "You said someone has to maintain containment." "That's true, but it's not the only reason." She looked back at the store, at the crooked aisles and overstuffed shelves and narrow spaces where shadow collected. "I keep it open because despite everything, despite the danger and the weirdness and the way it slowly reads everyone who works here, it's still a bookstore. It still connects people with stories. And stories, even dangerous ones, even ones that blur reality's edges, they're necessary. They're how we make sense of the world. Even when the stories start making sense of us? Especially then." She smiled, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely at peace. "We're all stories in the end, Ava. The question is whether we get to write ourselves or whether we let ourselves be written. You're one of the few people I've met who's fought to keep the pen. Don't lose that." She left. I stood in the doorway watching morning sunlight creep across the floor, illuminating the dust motes that drifted between shelves like suspended words. Somewhere in the history aisle, I heard a book fall. Soft, distant, almost gentle. I didn't investigate. Epilogue: 2 months later, a new help-wanted sign appeared in the window. Night clerk needed. Small independent bookstore. Quiet, cozy environment, experience with rare books preferred. Inquire within. The interview process was more rigorous this time. Mrs. Delacourt and I developed a screening system. Casual questions that revealed how potential employees dealt with ambiguity, whether they had overly strong needs to understand everything, and whether they could follow instructions they didn't agree with. We found someone eventually, a quiet woman in her 40s named Lauren, who'd worked library night shifts in Boston and seemed genuinely unbothered by unusual occurrences. "I once had a patron claim he'd checked out a book that didn't exist," she told us during the interview. "Insisted we had a copy, described the cover, quoted passages. We never found it in the system. After 20 years in..." Libraries, you learn that some things don't need explanations, just documentation. She was perfect. On her first night, I gave her the rule card, now laminated with Rule 9 included, and watched her read it with calm acceptance. "These are oddly specific," she observed. "They need to be," I replied. Have you ever broken them?" "Yes, I don't recommend it." She nodded, tucked the card in her pocket. "I'm good at following rules, that's why library work suited me." Lauren lasted 6 months before she moved to Oregon for family reasons. By then, I'd been working at Hemlock and Hearth for 9 months, had processed thousands of orders, reshelved tens of thousands of books, and had learned to navigate the building's moods and patterns with something approaching confidence. Mrs. Delacourt started leaving earlier, trusting me to handle closing procedures. Started letting me update the rules when new patterns emerged. Started training me subtly for the role I'd known since that conversation in the morning light I would eventually inherit. On my 1-year anniversary, she gave me a key to the storage room and a small leather-bound journal. Blank pages, expensive paper. "For documentation," she said. "Every guardian keeps records. David did, I do, and eventually you will. Not to understand we've learned that lesson, but to remember. To track patterns so the next person doesn't have to start from scratch." I accepted the journal, feeling its weight in my hands, literal and metaphorical. That night, alone in the store at 3 a.m., I opened the journal and wrote the first entry. April 15th. 1 year at Hemlock and Hearth. The building knows me now, knows my routines, my habits, the shape of my attention. It tests me less frequently, having cataloged what it needs. I hear footsteps sometimes that might be my own, echoing from other nights, other shifts. The boundary between Ava the person and Ava the night clerk is thinner than it was. Mrs. Delacourt says she'll retire in 3 years. Says I'll be ready by then to take over as primary guardian. I don't know if anyone's ever ready for that, but I understand now why she stayed so long. Why Marcus Webb and David Crane, despite escaping, despite surviving, still sent Christmas cards and postcards and maintained some thread of connection. We're written into this place, not as characters exactly, but as editors, curators, the ones who maintain the boundaries between story and reality, who keep the patterns contained, who warn the next generation that some books are better left unopened and some doors are better left locked. It's not the job I applied for, but it's become the job I need to do. Because someone has to keep the pen. Someone has to prevent this place from writing itself into the world beyond these walls. And right now, tonight, that someone is me. I closed the journal, returned it to the drawer beside the wrapped, unstickered book and Maya's picture book, and all the other artifacts that documented the building's attempts to finish stories it had started. From somewhere in the children's section, I heard pages turning. I didn't investigate. Outside, the world continued its normal routines, people sleeping in warm beds, dreaming ordinary dreams, unaware that a few blocks away, in a crooked old bookstore on a narrow brick street, the boundaries between fiction and reality were wearing thin. And someone was standing watch, making sure they didn't dissolve entirely, making sure the stories stayed on their shelves where they belonged, at least until the next shift.